everyone, welcome back to another video. Today I want to share with you 2 ways that you can color block your die cut backgrounds to give them some pops of color behind. Now for today's video I will be using these 2 SVG cut files. They are for free over on my blog. That link will be down in the description box below. But these methods will work whether you're using SVG files or die cut backgrounds. Either way works. I'm starting off with this paint splatter SVG file that's over on my blog. I cut 2 of these. They both measure 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, so full A2 size. And I've got my top folding card base that's A2 in size ready to go. If you don't know how to make your own card bases, I will leave that video linked in the top right hand corner for you. One of these I'm going to set off to the side. The next I am going to attach down with some glue to that card base. I just want to line it up and secure it down. What this first layer is going to be is essentially a guide. However, it's going to be a guide that stays in place. If you wanted to, you could temporarily put this down and use it more of a stencil, but I'm just going to secure it down permanently, and it's going to give me a little bit of lift behind when I go and attach that second one. Now next up, you're going to want to choose a color combination. I chose 8 Catherine Pooler ink colors. Here they all are ready to go. If you have trouble creating your own color combinations, I would suggest looking at Pinterest and creating a board. I have one that I like to put different color combinations on as I find them, and then I just kind of color match and pull from there. I'm also going to be using these small ink blending brushes. These are kind of the perfect size for this background, and these come from Amazon. They come a lot in a set, so I have one for each of my ink colors. I counted my paint swatches, and I have 32 on the background. I've got 8 colors, 32 divided by 8. Each one of these colors or paint colors is going to fill in 4 paint swatches. It's a little bit easier for me to figure that out ahead of time, so I don't overdo it on one color. I like to count what's on my background, divide that by the number of colors, and then I know exactly how many of these little puddles to fill in. I'm starting off with the Bellini color, and I'm just using the very tip of my brush to fill in 4 of these paint swatches. Now I don't want to put too many of them super close together just because you want them spread apart. I'm also focusing the tip right inside each one of those swatches and not going over into any of the little neighbors. You want to keep each one right inside that swatch. And that's what this background is essentially a stencil, and it's helping you see where each one of these colors needs to be. I like to double check with my clean background, if you will, and place that right over the top to make sure I like the way it looks. If I want to go in and add more color, I can, but I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next color, which is this blue, and then another meant to be. This is a beautiful shade of like a greenish blue, and I just continued that process with each one of my colors until my background was completely filled in. Now here you can see why it's so important to spread these out, because that way you're going to get such a great variation on your background and not 2 of the same colors close together. Now it looks like a hot mess until you place that final piece over the top. This is why we cut 2. That bottom layer is going to be your guide. Your top is your clean one to cover up that mess. With this top layer, you do need to make sure that you put enough glue for each one of those little sections to secure down. Because if it starts to lift, you will see that color underneath, and you don't want that. You want this securely down across the whole thing. That's why I'm using a glue stick. It's also going to allow it to lay flat. You could paint on a liquid glue if you wanted to, but that might cause this to curl up and some of those colors to bleed. That's why I just prefer a glue stick for this. I like to give it a good press and then put some sort of weight on top of that. I am using an acrylic block in this case, putting a piece of plastic packaging in between so it doesn't stick, and then I'll move on to finishing the card. Now the finishing of this card is really simple. I use this feather set that I personally created. I cut these out with my Cricut, and I'm just using some of those same colors from the background to very lightly color these in. And once I have each one of these colored in the way I like it, again, not applying very much color at all, but once I have them filled in, I'm going to use this hot foil gel with a dry brush strictly on the edges. This is a technique I did quite a while ago. I will leave that video linked in the top right hand corner. I did it on letters, which is a really cool effect, but I wanted to bring it back and use it just on the edges of these feathers to create a gilded look. It's going to be a distressed look. You really just want a very light touch of that. You want to use a really light hand and just kind of very lightly touch that onto the edges and drag it in. I like to use the product that's in the lid. Sometimes that can be a little bit drier. It won't pick up as well on the brush. I also like to use a very cheap brush with the kind of torn up bottom bristles to give me more of that effect. You don't need a lot of this. I just like to go around the edges where I want it. If you do want the edges a little bit more full, a little bit more of that golding effect on there, just turn your brush and use the edge of it to kind of gather up that gel. Then I set it aside to dry. Once it's dry, you can apply the foil. Now the hot foil gel, you do need to use the hot foil specifically. I will leave that linked over on my Amazon storefront in this idea list. And then you also need to use some sort of heating element. I'm using a laminator. You just put that foil on, shiny side up, put it in a carrier sheet. I just use a piece of paper folded in half and run that through my laminator. Once this comes out, you just let it cool for just a second, literally maybe 10 seconds if that, and then you can start to pull off that foil, and it creates this really great distressed brush stroked look. I absolutely love the way this one looks. I've made a few cards using this technique. Again, I did it in a previous video, which I will leave linked beforehand so you can check that out. But it's just this really cool distressed look that you can do with foil, where you don't have to foil the whole thing. You can just add little pops of it if you want. The foil I'm using is from Deco Foil. This is the champagne color. Not quite gold, not quite silver or bronze. It's just a really great neutral. But there's a close-up of those little feathers. I added a bow, a thanks sentiment, and that card was done. So this technique is great to transfer onto any die cut background that you may have on hand. And it's great for those sporadic sort of backgrounds. But the next technique is great if you have a background that is laid out like a grid, like this leaf is. So I've got 3 across and 3 down. Each one is spaced pretty symmetrically. So for this, I don't need to cut out another one. I can just use some pencil marks to make a guide for myself, a little grid, if you will. Now for this, I will be working on a panel. Both of these measure 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, so the background itself measures that, and then the panel behind it. I'm just overlaying that die cut right on top and using a pencil with light pencil marks to mark the left, the right, the top, and the bottom of each leaf. That's going to give me a good guide of where I need the color to expand to. So it can go past that mark, but I know that it needs to go at least up until that mark, but not over into the next section, if you will. So this is going to give me a great guide. And I was on a foil kick this day, and this is a great time to add some foil to your background itself by just cutting out little rectangles that fit into that grid of adhesive. So I have this adhesive sheeting. This is from scrapbook.com, but you can find it on Amazon. I will leave that linked as well over on that Amazon supply list. I just like to measure it, eyeball it. I don't do any really measuring, just lay it up there, make sure it fits and doesn't go into the next sections. And I will do that for 2 of these spaces. So I've got 5 different ink colors plus foil. So some of these are going to get ink, some are going to get foil, some are going to get Some of the ink colors will only be used once, some of them twice. But I knew I wanted 2 areas of gold foil, so I went ahead and put those down to where they weren't right next to each other, but also not symmetrically aligned, if you will. And I just placed those down, and then I'm going to be using some masking tape or painter's tape, whatever it is you have on hand, to mark off those areas with the pencil marks. And just to double check myself, I like to use that background, just overlay it and make sure that I have them kind of laid out correctly. I also have to remember each time to erase those pencil marks. So once you put the ink down over the top, you can erase them. You will be able to see through unless you use some sort of really heavy pigment ink. But most of the inks that are ink blending inks are dye inks. They're transparent in nature. You will be able to see those pencil marks. So just erase them once you have it mapped out, and then start ink blending away. I am using a couple of Distress inks and then one Catherine Pooler ink as well to create this very fallish background. I know it's the middle of summer right now, or spring here, excuse me. But I wanted to go for a fall looking, very vibrant background. Now, once I get the ink down and I remove my masking tape, I like to check to make sure that I went far enough. So on this one, I didn't go quite enough to the right with my ink, so I'll just move my masking tape over a little bit and fill in that area with some more ink. It's very forgiving, this technique, as long as you don't go too far over into the next one, you're okay. Then I will just move on to the next section. And again, mapping it out with the masking tape, putting it down, and then just double checking with that overlay and moving the masking tape around until I have completely filled the car front with little rectangles of color. And like I said, this one doesn't exactly fit where I can do 2 of each color. So for these last couple of colors, I'll only do 1 of each until I have this background. Now I still have those areas where I want to add some foil in. I'm using gold foil from Deco Foil. This is a great technique to use up those little scraps that maybe have some scratches on them or those kinds of like flaws. You can just use up the tiniest little piece to add some background color. To apply this foil, I just simply remove the backing paper from that adhesive and then just lay the foil on top. Kind of start at one end and press down until you get to the next, and then just use my finger to burnish. You don't want to use anything too heavy like a scraping tool or a popsicle stick or anything like that to burnish it down. Just your finger works great. And just continue to press down until you get a nice seal all the way across. And when you lift up that foil, the foil will be stuck to the adhesive. If you have any areas where it doesn't quite stick, or maybe you had a scratch in that area, just overlay the foil and burnish it down a little bit more from a different area and it will stick right down to that exposed adhesive. And one final check, and I've got this beautiful background ready to go. Now here you can see I have a little bit of area on that orange that just wasn't fully covered. I didn't catch it as I was checking up. So here I have just this little stick that I'm going to use to add a little bit of color. Now if you don't have any stick like this, I will leave them linked on Amazon. They're great to have on hand for these occasions, but a Q-tip will work, a small makeup sponge will work, anything like that, just to fill in those little areas. Then you can just attach this once you have it fully covered. It really is that simple. And once you overlay this top portion, nobody's going to know you have this messy grid of color underneath. It looks absolutely beautiful and well blended. Your blending skills don't even need to be great for this technique. I love the way this one turned out. Now I did want to show this part as well, just because I recently made handmade paper on my channel. I showed y'all how to do that. And here I am using it. This is something I actually do use in not only my journaling, but my card making. I'm using it to back my sympathy stamp, stamp sentiment, excuse me. I just attach that down to the handmade paper, trim it up with my scissors, and I just ripped that handmade paper. It creates a beautiful textured effect. And it was really the simplest finish to this card so the background could stand out. But there you have it, another great way to color block out your backgrounds that you die cut or SVG cut files in my instance. I love using these techniques for all of my SVG cut files and my background dies to just add a little pop of color. And then all I need is a sentiment, maybe a few little extra things, and my cards are good to go. That's going to do it for me today. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you haven't subscribed already, you can do that now. Happy crafting, everybody.